Okay, so we're gonna work on making a rattle out of 2 pinch pots. So my pots were starting to get a bit dry, so I went ahead and covered them pretty tightly in plastic. And while I'm working on my 2 pinch pots that are going to become my rattle, I'm gonna set these others aside and I'm going to put them in the plastic. If you've got another board or a piece of drywall, you can go ahead and put them on there with however much covering they need for how dry they are. But I'm kind of trying to imagine that I just really have a board to work on. Okay, so I've got my 2 pinch pots, and I'm going to be scratching and scoring these 2 lips of the pots, and I'm going to put them together. So in order to do that, I am going to use my needle tool. If you have a fork around that you're not going to use for food later, you might want to use that, and I'm just going to show you why. I'm going to basically scratch and score, as the name implies. But I guess the important thing is that I'm going to do a lot of it. And as you can see, this takes a few minutes. Now, what I want you to not do is just make a few little lines like that. So this is not enough. This is really good. Using the fork can actually speed up the process. So we're gonna do this cross hatching. We're essentially making clay Velcro. So yeah, we're gonna do that. I'm gonna do the other one. I might just speed this video along. Okay, so real quick, just remember, this is not enough. This is looking much better. So we want it to be very mixed up. Before we put our pieces together, I'm gonna take a little piece of clay and I'm just gonna make some little bits like this. I would say at least 5. You don't wanna do too many because you want there to be room in there. These I'm gonna roll into balls and I'm just gonna drop into my rattle. These will probably stick right now because all the clay is so wet, but once it's fired and they dry out, they will not stay attached and they will rattle inside of your rattle. Okay, so once I've scratched and scored both parts, I'm going to add just a little bit of water, and remember, we don't want to add too much water. Too much water can make a muddy mess, but I have my sponge pretty full of water, and without really squeezing it at all, I'm just going to tap it along where I've scratched and scored. So just enough that a little bit of water goes into that cross hatching that I created. You can also use a paintbrush for this. Any old paintbrush will work. Now we're going to take both sides and we're going to put them together. And keep an eye on, oops, there we go. Keep an eye on the Velcro part. I'm really squishing it, and if you were in this room with me, you'd actually hear a little bit of clay noise, and you see some bubbles coming out. And I'm just kind of using my thumbs here to put the pieces together very firmly. Now, the way that you know that your clay is attached is obviously if I rip this off, it's gonna come off, but if I just put a little bit of pressure, it's not going anywhere. That's how you know that it's worked. If I were to let go and this side were just to droop off, then you know that it's not gonna stay on. And a couple of reasons for that might be that you didn't do enough scratching and scoring, or that there's a little too much water, in which case you could set these aside and let that dry out a little and then repeat the scratching and scoring just to get it nice and Velcro-y again, and add just a little less water. It would need to be quite a bit of water to keep it from really connecting, but that is something to look out for. All right, so now I'm gonna add a coil into this seam here to make this a really strong attachment. So I grabbed a little chunk of clay and I'm gonna roll this into a snake or a coil, and notice I'm just using this top part of my fingers. We'll talk a little more about coils when we get to project 1. But for right now, I want to make a very thin and even coil. It definitely doesn't have to be perfect, but it does not have to be perfect. I'm going to place it into the seam And as you can see, I'm just using my finger to press it firmly in there. And I'm just going to go all the way around until I reach the part where I meet my original part. And using my finger, I'm just going to dip it in just a little bit of water. I'm just going to smooth this. So I'm dipping in just a little bit of water and I'm smoothing it in. So this is something that's really cool about plastic clay, is we can actually just smush it together, and that will often hold it together. Of course, we've got two separate pieces of clay, so we scratched and scored those together, but now we can just smush. All right, so we've done a significant piece of construction, so we're gonna leave this under plastic for 24 hours. And then after that, we can take it out and start working on really smoothing it. Okay, so it's 24 hours later, and this has gotten a bit harder. As you can see, I can still almost put a fingerprint. So I'm going to call this soft leather hard, but it's very much supporting itself. This coil, where I put the coil in, now I can really smooth it because it has equalized. So yesterday, that spot where I put the coil in, it was a lot wetter than the rest of the pot. So if I messed with it too much, I would probably just end up pulling it out or causing it some damage. But now I can really smooth it. So I'm going to use my metal rib, and I'm going to smooth it out a bit. Now, when clay is wet, when it's still plastic, and it is still a little plastic at this soft leather hard stage, then we are never going to get like a perfectly smooth surface. Usually I smooth it as best I can, and then I let it get to almost finished, almost dry, and then I do one last pass with a sponge. We're definitely not looking for perfection right now, but for anyone who is sort of inclined to perfection, I just want to say that, yeah, we're going to get it a little smoother, but it's really not going to be perfect yet. And in fact, these are all handmade objects, so they probably will never be completely perfect. But as you can see, just using the metal rib has smoothed it out quite a bit. Now, I also got some clay movement, as you can see here, but when I use my sponge, it usually comes right off. And I have a pretty smooth, oh, this is a little chunky, so let me just take my rib. Okay, so this is now pretty smooth. And now you can decide, or you may have already decided in your sketches, what to do with this. Something else that we can do, if you have like a wooden spatula, you can use it, we call this a paddle, but sometimes we can just use our wooden rib and just kind of basically smack the clay, and we can kind of shape it. So this is just helping me shape it into a more perfect sphere. You might not be going for a perfect sphere, I'm just showing you how to shape your clay. Right now at this stage, there's no where for air to escape. So there's air trapped inside of here, and that is kind of pushing out. Eventually, during this stage, you're gonna wanna poke a hole in it. But right now, what we might be adding to it, we'll leave that air in there to put some pressure on the inside so that we keep this nice round shape.